He showed up with a shovel to help a stranger, not knowing she held the keys to everything he'd lost. 12 years. And all I got was an email. That's what Darius Monroe said out loud to no one, sitting alone in his rusted-out pickup just outside of Wichita Falls, Texas. The rain hit the windshield like it had something personal against him, and the wipers didn't do much but smear the mess around. On the passenger seat sat a brown envelope, final paycheck, company logo pen, and a copy of his termination summary. No face-to-face meeting, no handshake, no reason. Just a line that read, "Position eliminated due to restructuring." But Darius wasn't stupid. He'd seen the writing on the wall long before the email came through. He'd watched younger, less experienced men get promoted while he trained them. Watched a certain project manager flinch every time Darius offered feedback. Watched the jokes, those slick little comments in the break room, fly when they thought he wasn't paying attention. He was tired, but not surprised. What hurt the most wasn't the insult. It was the timing. Rent was due in a week. School supplies for his 2 kids, Alana and Micah, weren't cheap. And his savings? Wiped out 6 months ago when Micah got sick and insurance didn't cover everything. He looked at his hands, cracked, calloused, built for labor, and then at the rain-streaked road ahead. One deep breath, then another. Gotta keep moving. He started the engine. 3 towns over, Darius had lined up a couple of small jobs, gutting drywall from a flood-damaged church in Burke Burnett, replacing fence posts for a rancher whose knees had given out, even hauling scrap for a mechanic who paid in $20 bills and old sandwiches. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept gas in the tank and food on the table. He didn't complain. He didn't have time to. Every morning, he dropped Alana and Micah off at a neighbor's before heading out with a thermos of coffee and a toolbox that was older than his daughter. Every night, he came home sore, but grateful. Grateful he still had work, even if it was barely scraping by. But still, something was breaking inside him. Each job reminded him of what he'd lost. His pride, his routine, the respect he once earned on job sites just by walking in. Now he was just another guy looking for day labor, hoping someone needed a strong back and didn't care too much about the rest. That week, the rain wouldn't stop. Roads were closing, fields were drowning, and jobs drying up. Darius sat in a diner just outside Henrietta, sipping bitter coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since last week. His phone buzzed, another rejection email. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and looked out the window. Across the road, a woman in muddy boots was knee-deep in a ditch, swinging a shovel like her life depended on it. Her back was hunched. Her hands looked raw from work. Nobody else around. Something about it felt off. He watched for a second longer. She slipped, went down hard. Darius was already on his feet. He didn't even finish his coffee. The mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the road. Rain still came down in thin sheets. She was already getting back up, cursing under her breath and trying to scoop water with her hands. "Need a hand?" he called out, already rolling up his sleeves. She turned, startled. Tall, mid-50s maybe, tough face, but kind eyes. Her expression held a mix of pride and relief. "I'm fine," she lied. "You sure? 'Cause I'm looking at this mess and it don't look fine." She gave a half smile. "Fair point." Darius dropped his bag in the mud and pulled out a spade. No handshake, no formal introduction, just 2 strangers working side by side in the rain. They didn't say much at first, just worked. Shovel, toss, scoop, dump. The kind of silence that earns respect without asking for it. After half an hour, she broke it. "You local?" "Nope. Passing through, looking for work." She nodded. "You're good at this." "Been doing it a long time." She didn't ask what happened, and he didn't tell her. But something told him this wouldn't be his last time helping her. But he had no idea who she really was, or what that mud was about to dig up. The next morning, Darius was back. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't even know her last name. But something about the way she'd looked at him, like she saw him, not just used him, stuck in his mind. Besides, he'd seen the flood line creeping up overnight. That field was going to drown if someone didn't do something. He pulled up to the same gravel path. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, just enough to soak your bones without feeling dramatic. Darius parked, tossed his gloves onto the dash, and got out. She was already outside, dragging a hose across a trench like it owed her money. You again? She called, not angry, almost surprised. You looked like you could use backup, Darius replied, grabbing his shovel. She chuckled. Name's Evelyn, by the way. Darius. They shook hands, finally. You don't have to do this, you know. I can pay someone. I need the hours, he cut in. Don't worry, I won't complain. Evelyn studied him for a second, like she was trying to read something between the lines. Then she nodded. All right, let's see what you've got. The next few hours were nothing but work. They built makeshift trenches to drain runoff into the lower pasture, piled sandbags along the barn's edge, and cleared out the irrigation canal that had turned into a swamp. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. They worked in silence again, except this time it wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. Midday, Evelyn disappeared into the house and came back out with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a couple of lukewarm sodas. I hope you are not picky, she said, handing him a sandwich. He took a bite. Not at all. Ham and mustard tastes like steak when you're hungry. She laughed, sat on the overturned bucket next to him. You always this helpful? Darius shrugged. When I can be. You got a family? Yeah, 2 kids. Alana's 11, Micah's 8. Smart. Way smarter than me. That's not hard, she teased, elbowing him. He grinned. Okay, fair. They sat for a while, eating and watching the water crawl away from the fields they'd saved. Evelyn pulled her hood back, revealing gray streaks in her curls and a tiredness around her eyes that had nothing to do with the weather. You ever run a farm before? She asked. Nope, but I know how to fix things. That's half the battle. He looked around. The barn was old but solid. The land stretched farther than he'd realized. Fields, fencing, silos, even a greenhouse in the distance. This all yours? Some of it, she said vaguely. Family land. I'm just the one keeping it alive. He didn't push, but something didn't add up. Her boots were worn, sure, but her truck, a dusty black Escalade, didn't fit the picture. Neither did the solar panels he spotted behind the barn. This wasn't just some struggling farmer scraping by, but she wasn't offering, and he wasn't asking. Not yet. Over the next few days, Darius kept coming back. He showed up early, stayed late, worked through rain, and even brought Micah once, who immediately bonded with Evelyn's shepherd mix, Pepper. She let them park closer, offered dinner a couple times, even paid him under the table, though he never asked. And slowly, the guard between them started to fall. One evening, after they finished reinforcing the chicken coop, Evelyn leaned on her shovel and said, You know, Darius, you're good company. He wiped sweat from his brow. So are you, for someone who talks so little. She laughed. What can I say? Shoveling mud is spiritual work. Then we must be priests by now. That night, he drove home with dirt under his nails and something else in his chest. Peace. It had been a while since he felt that. But while Darius was starting to find comfort in the mud, Evelyn was starting to recognize a name she hadn't heard in months. And it was about to change everything. Evelyn sat alone on her back porch, a chipped mug of black coffee resting on her thigh, steam rising faintly into the muggy evening air. She stared out at the fields, now finally drying. Darius had helped more than he probably realized. She hadn't asked for his loyalty or his sweat or his time, but he gave it anyway, day after day, like he had something to prove. And something about that bugged her. Not because it was a problem, but because it felt familiar. She took another sip, looked down at her phone, scrolled back through old company memos. Her inbox had been a graveyard for 6 months, ever since she stepped away from Iron Vale Industries after her husband's passing. She'd left the boardroom and vanished into this farmland with no press release, no announcement. Most people didn't even know she was gone, and that was the point. But now, sitting there in her flannel shirt and mud-caked jeans, Evelyn couldn't shake the name Darius Monroe from her mind. She'd seen it somewhere, and it wasn't on a shovel. That night, curiosity gave way to action. She cracked open her laptop for the first time in weeks. Password still worked. She typed his name into the Iron Vale employee portal. Monroe, Darius L. Terminated February 2nd. Termination reason, failure to adhere to supervisory protocol during Site 11 project. She frowned. That didn't sound like the man she'd been working beside. Darius followed every instruction she gave without question, Hell, half the time, he took initiative and fixed things she hadn't noticed were broken yet. She clicked through to the complaint notes, 3 separate write-ups, all filed by the same person, Jonathan R. Lawton. Jonathan R. Lawton. Her mouth tightened. Lawton had been a problem for years, smooth talker in meetings, but more than one HR complaint had crossed her desk with his name attached. Nothing ever stuck. He covered his tracks well, too well. But now, with fresh eyes and a real human face tied to one of his disciplinary actions, the pattern was too clear. Lawton hadn't been documenting insubordination, he'd been targeting. She dug deeper, internal emails, time cards, even project reports. Darius had worked longer hours than most, got consistently high evaluations, until Lawton took over Site 11. That's when everything went sideways. Evelyn stared at the screen, heart pounding like she'd just run a mile. She'd been CEO for 9 years. 9 years of quarterly reports and PR statements and sleek presentations about diversity and inclusion. And right under her nose, one of her managers had been quietly pushing out the very people they claimed to support. She stood up, shaking now, not from fear, from shame. The next morning, she didn't mention anything to Darius. She handed him a list of repairs for the barn doors, made small talk about the weather, and pretended like nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. She watched the way he wiped his boots before walking into the barn, how he triple-checked his measurements before cutting, how he moved with care, with patience. This wasn't some lazy hire that needed to be watched. This was a man who'd been failed by people in power, by her. That evening, Evelyn got on a Zoom call with Ironvale's interim COO. I need you to pull every disciplinary action filed by Jonathan Lawton in the past 4 years, and I want HR to re-interview every employee he's supervised. The man on the screen blinked. May I ask why? She looked straight into the camera. Because I've seen firsthand what he calls a violation, and I'm not letting this company be built on that kind of rot. Not on my name. She didn't wait for a response, just ended the call. That night, she sat on her porch again, lights off, stars flickering through the humid air. She heard Darius's truck start up from down the road, kids laughing in the back seat. He didn't know what she'd found, didn't know who she was, not yet. But he was going to. But telling the truth wouldn't just cost her his respect. It might reopen wounds she wasn't sure he'd forgive her for touching. The sun came out for the first time in a week. Darius stood at the edge of the field, sleeves rolled up, shirt soaked through with sweat instead of rain. He looked out at the rows of freshly drained earth. There was still work to do, but the worst of it was over. Evelyn walked up behind him, hands in the pockets of her faded jeans. Looks good, he nodded. We stopped the water just in time. Because of you. Darius looked down, just glad to be useful. She hesitated. Listen, you got a minute? There's something I need to talk to you about. He turned to her, curious. Sure. Not here. Come by the house tonight, after the kids are settled, if you can. That was it. No hint of what was coming. He said okay, and went back to digging fence holes, thinking maybe she needed help with paperwork or taxes or something, but she was pacing that entire afternoon. Later that evening, the kids were fed, showered, and out like lights. Darius pulled into the gravel driveway, the farmhouse glowing dimly through the trees. He knocked. Evelyn answered in sweats and a hoodie, no makeup, no act. Thanks for coming, she said, letting him in. He stepped into a living room lined with books and old family portraits, cozy, real. She gestured toward the couch, then sat across from him, laptop on the coffee table between them. Darius furrowed his brow. Everything okay? Evelyn paused. There's something I haven't told you, and I owe you the truth. He didn't speak. She opened the laptop, turned it toward him. You remember this logo? Ironvale? He asked. His voice was tight. Yeah, I'm the CEO. Or I was, until I stepped down 6 months ago. Darius leaned back, lips parting slightly. You're... what? I didn't recognize you at first, but when your name started ringing a bell, I looked into it. I looked into you. His jaw tensed, eyes narrowing. Why? Because I needed to know why someone like you, smart, skilled, dependable, got pushed out without so much as a phone call. Silence. Evelyn clicked into the termination file, brought up the complaints, the timelines, the emails. I read every report, every timestamp, every project note, and I'm sorry, Darius. You were set up. He didn't move. I let it happen. I let someone like Lawton stay in power. I thought I was running a company that did things right, but I wasn't looking close enough. He spoke quietly. You had no idea? I trusted people to do their jobs, and they abused it. And now you're the one paying the price. He swallowed hard. You know what it's like to explain to your kids that you don't know where the next meal's coming from? To feel like you did something wrong when all you did was show up and work? She nodded, fighting tears. I should have been watching. I should have protected people like you. The room fell quiet again, thick with words neither of them said. Darius rubbed his hands together slowly. So what now? You just tell me this and move on? No, she said, voice steady now. I'm fixing it. I already started an internal investigation. Lawton's on administrative leave. HR is re-interviewing everyone he's supervised. We're rebuilding the accountability structure from the ground up. He didn't look impressed. I'm not asking for praise, she added. I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Darius stared at her, then shook his head. You can't fix what that man took from me. He took more than a job. He made me feel invisible. And your company let him. I know, she whispered, but I also saw who you are when no one's watching. You showed up, every day, not because of who I am, but because it was the right thing to do. His hands clenched, then loosened. I didn't come here for charity, he muttered. This isn't charity, she said. This is acknowledgement. Darius looked away, eyes scanning the floor like it might hold the answers. Finally, he said, I don't know if I trust you. Evelyn nodded. You don't have to. Just let me prove that I see you now. But trust, once broken, isn't something that comes back with a few words, especially when your entire life's been built on earning what others were handed. The next morning, Darius didn't show up. No text, no call, no truck pulling down the gravel path with that squeaky brake he hadn't gotten around to fixing. Evelyn stood by the gate, gloves on, tools ready, but no Darius. She waited, checked her phone, waited some more. Then she went inside. Darius sat on the back porch of his duplex, staring at the dirt patch that used to be grass before life got too busy. Micah and Alana were playing with sidewalk chalk near the driveway, their voices faint in the background. His head was somewhere else. Evelyn's words played in a loop. I let it happen. I should have protected people like you. I'm sorry. He didn't know what to do with that. The anger was still there, sitting heavy in his chest like cement. But there was something else underneath it too. Something like confusion. She didn't have to tell him the truth. She could have let him keep digging ditches, collecting cash under the table, going home at night none the wiser. But she didn't. And that meant something. Didn't it? 3 days passed. No contact. Evelyn didn't reach out again. She didn't call or push or make a show of it. She just kept working. Alone. Then, on Thursday morning, Darius's truck rolled back up the driveway. She looked up from where she was stacking lumber by the shed. He got out, slowly, like his boots weighed more than usual. Hey, she said, wiping her hands. Hey. They stood in silence. You disappeared, she added softly. I had to think. Fair. More silence. Darius looked past her toward the barn. You finished the drainage system? Yeah, barely. You trained me well. A weak smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Doubt that. Evelyn stepped forward. Look, I meant what I said. I'm not trying to buy forgiveness. I'm not trying to play hero. I needed you to know the truth. He nodded slowly. I know. That's the part that's messing me up. She tilted her head. Why? Because I've been angry for months. Angry at the system. Angry at the silence. Angry at myself. And now you come in and admit what most folks in your position would have buried, and it don't fit in the box I built for you. That's a good thing, right? He shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. Still figuring that out. She took a step closer. Let me say this, then I'll leave you alone. You were wronged. I let that happen. But if you ever decide you want something more, something better, there's a place for you at Iron Vale. A real position, above board, with benefits, respect. Darius raised an eyebrow. You offering me a job? I'm offering you a future, but it's your choice. He crossed his arms, thinking. Feels weird. What does? Coming back to the place that kicked me out like I didn't matter. Even if the top's different now, the floor's still the same. She nodded slowly. Then let's rebuild the floor. He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, he didn't see a boss or a CEO or a rich landowner. He saw a woman who'd worked beside him in the mud, a woman who messed up but didn't run, who stood still and took the blame. That didn't make it all better, but it made it real. Later that day, they worked side by side again, not in silence this time. They talked, laughed a little, bickered over the best way to seal a beam. Nothing was fixed, not yet. But something had shifted, and when Darius left that evening, he didn't take the long way home. But rebuilding trust is like rebuilding a field after a flood, slow, dirty, and full of surprises you don't see coming. 2 weeks later, Darius stood in front of a mirrored glass door that read, Iron Vale Industries, North Texas Regional Office, Operations and Safety Division. He adjusted his shirt collar for the third time. It felt strange, wearing something without mud on it. Alana had ironed it for him that morning. Micah handed him his lunch bag like it was his first day of school. Go show 'em who they messed with, Daddy, Alana had said, arms crossed like a coach before a championship. That stuck with him. Now here he was, new boots, fresh start, same heart. Inside, Evelyn sat at the far end of a quiet conference room, flipping through safety reports. She looked up when he walked in. You made it, she said. Barely, he joked. Almost turned around twice. She stood and offered a hand, not a boss's handshake, not a politician's gesture, just one person to another. Let's walk. They stepped outside into the late afternoon heat. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting gold over everything. I thought about that offer for a long time, Darius said. I figured. I didn't take it because I needed saving. I know. I took it because I've got 2 kids watching me, and I want them to see what self-respect looks like, even after life knocks you down. Evelyn nodded, eyes on the horizon. You ever think you'd be here again? No, he admitted, but I'm starting to think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. They walked in silence for a few seconds, the hum of cicadas, a bird somewhere off in the distance. New position's yours to shape, Evelyn said. You report directly to me, nobody else. Even Lawton? Lawton's gone. Darius stopped walking. Gone? Fired, with cause. HR found 3 more cases just like yours. They're talking to legal now. He let out a slow breath. Took long enough. Yeah, she said, but it's happening. They stood under the edge of the building, light breeze picking up, a few dark clouds forming in the distance, summer storm brewing. Funny, Darius said, glancing up. Started with a flood. Looks like it might end with one too. She smirked. Full circle. He shook his head, grinning. Nah, this ain't the end. Back at home, Alana taped a note to the fridge that read, Dad's first day back. Underneath, a drawing of him holding a hammer in one hand and a crown in the other. Micah added a dog next to it. That's Pepper, he'd said proudly. Darius stared at that note after dinner, just stood there in the kitchen while the kids argued over whose turn it was to do dishes. And for the first time in months, he didn't feel like something was slipping through his fingers. He felt grounded, present, whole. We all go through moments where life feels unfair, where the weight of things we didn't cause still finds a way to land on our shoulders. But sometimes, healing starts in the most unexpected places, with muddy boots, a second chance, and the courage to show up even when nobody's clapping. Darius didn't get his old job back. He got something better. A voice, a seat at the table, a future he built on his own terms. And Evelyn? She didn't just repair a wrong. She listened. She changed. She led. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or flat out dismissed, remember this. What they take doesn't define you. What you rebuild does. Don't wait for permission to rise. Just rise. And if you know someone who needs to hear that, share this story with them. Let them know they're not alone.